In this discussion, we shall address the question of the origins of communal politics in India in the later half of the 19th century. In Indian history, communal politics is usually studied in terms of the Hindu-Muslim divide that took the path of Muslim separatism at the turn of the 19th century, eventually climaxing in the emergence of Pakistan in 1947 with the unfortunate division of India which accompanied freedom from British rule. There is always a temptation for historians to trace the lineage of Pakistan in the later half of the 19th century when the Muslim elites started demanding certain special privileges from the colonial state. But such arguments often miss out on the point that men like Syed Ahmed Khan, to cite just one example, were trying to defend the privileges of an entrenched North Indian Muslim elite and were not actually looking for a separate state. Separatism certainly emerged at the turn of the 19th century in an entirely different context. And as you go into this context of why this kind of communitarianism that a man like Syed Ahmed Khan represented eventually looked for the creation of Pakistan, how did it happen? Because even when you look at separatisms were of many kinds. I mean, you had Tamil separatism at one stage. You had different kinds of separatism emerging their heads at different historical conjunctures. But we usually do not see them as the success story of separatist tendencies in Indian politics. We look at Muslim separatism just because it succeeded in creating the modern state of Pakistan. So as we return to this question of this transition from communitarianism to an overtly communal politics that eventually defined its character by claiming a separate state, nationalist historiography naturally calls attention to the divide and rule strategy, the kind of divisive strategies that the colonial state had adopted since the later half of the 19th century by playing the Muslims against the Hindus or by playing the Hindus against the Muslims, by tinkering with religious controversies, by manipulating their linguistic identities, the Urdu Nagri controversy, etc., by using the census in order to define the basic characteristics of Indian population in religious terms. And the moment the state recognition to this kind of superordinate identity determined by religion, it created a certain kind of homogeneous conception of Muslim community. And the result was that some of the Muslim leaders also could easily fall back upon this kind of an imagining of the community by the state itself in homogeneous terms. Certainly we shall turn to this question later, but at this point it is relevant because the main foundations of nationalist historiography would call attention to the different kinds of strategies that the colonial state adopted in placing the Muslims against the Hindus and Muslims understood in homogeneous terms. The same kind of approach one finds in one of the classic partly official statement about Muslim communal feelings in the later half of the 19th century in a famous work by W. Hunter. Hunter, as you know, was involved in the great compilation called the Statistical Account of Bengal, a kind of a scholar official who was interested in ethnology, who was interested in statistical service, and he wrote that famous book called Indian Muslimans in the early part of the 1870s, in which he tried to argue that much of their communal sentiments arise from their feeling of exclusion from the ruling order in the new dispensation of British rule. The Muslims were the ruling classes in large parts of India in pre-colonial times, and once they were excluded from such positions of authority under colonial rule, with the newly English educated elites stepping into the vacuum, becoming more important as district officials, as bureaucrats in the British Indian administration. The sentiments of these high class elites among the Muslim aristocracy in northern India were injured by this kind of a feeling of exclusion. And for certain reasons, they were also resistant to the idea of taking to English education, partly because of that kind of injured self-esteem. So Hunter's argument was that the backwardness measured in terms of their failure to become English educated, their failure to retain their positions of authority in the government, all these created a kind of feeling of alienation which ultimately led to their claims for special privileges, their claims for special treatment, their articulation of their feeling of alienation from mainstream political life represented by the Congress.
Excuse me, sir. Can Hunter's argument about the Muslim backwardness be accepted as the basis for separatist politics?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because that is where in fact the problem lies, because Hunter is as much guilty of a kind of homogenization as some of the other contemporaries were. The imperial policy in fact was the victim of the same kind of vision. Muslims were not a very homogeneous group, contrary to what Hunter wished us to believe. They were linguistically divided, regionally divided. There was no commonality between the large majority of Muslim peasants in eastern Bengal and the Sharif Muslims of United Provinces or North India, who were leading the separatist movement in the early part of the 20th century. And since United Provinces was the origin of the early separatist tents in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it is important to see the working of what we may call the politics for privilege. I mean, here you have a group of people who are very different from the large majority of the peasants in Bengal, for example. The Muslim peasants, residents of rural areas, they spoke Bengali. They were not Urdu speaking, unlike the elites of the urban areas among the Muslims. The North Indian Muslims had, despite the fact that they were only 14% of the total population in the province, controlled substantial chunks of landed property, controlled a fairly high percentage of government jobs in the subordinate bureaucracy, in the judicial services. So it was not as if that the kind of communitarianism that we come across among the Muslims in the late 19th century was the work of a backward community. I mean, the leading figures like Syed Ahmed Khan, for example, and his followers in Aligarh school, who were demanding such special treatment for the Muslims, did not actually come from a backward community. If you go to Punjab, you will come across huge estate owners among the Muslims. So the theory of backwardness actually breaks down at this point when we see, and this had been suggested by Francis Robinson in a very important thesis on this subject years ago during the 1970s, separatism among the Indian Muslims, focusing on the politics for privilege practiced by this North Indian Muslim elite, suggesting that you see the origin of separatism in a context where you don't come across the kind of backwardness that you see among the peasants of Bengal. So it was basically a politics for privilege that these men were practicing, and Syed Ahmed Khan was a very important example of how a Muslim nobleman who had been drafted into the judicial bureaucracy in British rule, who was willing to study English and who would like English education to be accepted by his co-religionists. He was a modernist. He wished the Muslims, his co-religionists, to become a part of the new imperial system. So this man, when he was viciously attacking the Congress, he was hitting the nail on the head. Because Syed Ahmed Khan's main contention, at a time when communitarianism had not yet set the stage for the rise of an overtly communal politics at a time when communitarianism was very anxious to protect some of the privileges of an established elite of North India, Syed Ahmed Khan attacked the Congress on the ground that the Congress was actually espousing the principles of a competitive society. A society which should allow a low-born man to compete for even higher status in society through competitive examinations, something which these aristocrats of northern India didn't wish to tolerate.
Sir, if this was the feeling among the Muslim elite, did it necessarily imply a statement in favor of a separate state?
No, certainly not. That is the point that I am actually trying to strike at. That Syed Ahmed Khan was an opponent of the Congress. And if you say Congress represented the mainstream nationalism, Syed Ahmed Khan looked upon the Congress as a civil war, arguing that the Congress was a camouflage for the pursuit of self-interest or the class interest of the English-educated elites, predominantly Bengalis. In fact, from the early part of the 19th century, the Bengali English-educated elites, who happened to be the first collaborators of the British, became appointed in the lower services and accompanied the British in their onward journey towards northern India. With the result that by the middle of the 19th century, the Bengali immigrants had become firmly entrenched in the professional life and in the services all over northern India. And the class that Syed Ahmed Khan represented, the declining Mughal aristocracy, found the presence of the Bengalis irksome because they had taken over local power that the Muslim aristocracy had enjoyed in the past as representatives of the Mughal order. So Syed Ahmed Khan thought that the Congress and the Congress demand for a competitive examination was a sort of a camouflage for these professional classes firmly entrenched in Bengal, but at the same time fanning out to other parts of India their self-interest by the idea of a competitive society, by the idea of a competitive examination. So this was one dimension. This was one aspect of Syed Ahmed Khan's thinking in terms of which he saw the Congress as a threat. But there was another dimension as well. The Congress very constantly spoke in favor of representative government. The principle of representation to be operative from the lower levels of the government to the higher legislatures. Now, this whole principle of representation was also a point of threat to the Muslim elites. They could realize how the Hindu majority, the trading and the professional classes could easily mobilize support from within the Hindu communities and would actually impose the rule by the majority on a minority which had in the past enjoyed a fairly privileged position, which had enjoyed positions of authority in the past. So there was an instinctive opposition and finally denial of this principle of competition that the Congress represented. Competitive examination for recruitment in the services, competition for votes, competition for electoral support in order to be able to assume positions of authority in the representative bodies. When Syed Ahmed Khan saw these principles espoused by the Congress, he thought that Congress represented a very major threat to the power and position of the Muslim aristocracy in northern India. So once again you see how the politics for privilege was at work. A threatened Muslim elite saw the Congress as a threat because the Congress was espousing certain principles which were unacceptable to the elites.
Sir, was this kind of politics of privilege limited to North India only?
No, not really, but North India was the main scene. Because by then you have those institutions emerging in North India. The Aligarh College is the most prominent example. But in North India, you have the main seat of the Ashrafs, the Sharif Muslims who had been members of the Mughal bureaucracy in earlier times. But also in Bengal, you see similar examples of communitarianism in the activities of men like Abdul Latif, the founder of Mohammedan Literary Society, or Syed Amir Ali, the Central National Mohammedan Association, which came up with similar kinds of ideas demanding special treatment. And you have the Nawab of Dhaka as another Sharif Muslim who can be easily clubbed together with Amir Ali, but Nawab of Dhaka, as you know, played a very critical role when the Muslim League was set up early in the 20th century. So it is not really confined to United Provinces alone, but when you look at the activities of the Sharif Muslims in Calcutta or in Bengal, you see also how the Sharif Muslims remained somewhat distant from the rank and file of the Muslim community, predominantly peasants. And when you look at this peasant society, you see how the peasant society for many years carried the imprint of a syncretic culture in India, which emerged out of the fusion between Hindu devotionalism and Islamic devotion like Sufism, and they were not culturally inclined towards the kind of separatist identity that the Sharif Muslims would naturally lap up as a self-strengthening measure, as a measure to proclaim their distinct identity in order to acquire privileges. So, in Punjab also, if you look at the peasant society in Sindh, you see the imprint of this kind of syncretism. A time came when the syncretic culture began to be eroded by something which we call the politics of identity.
Sir, what exactly does politics of identity mean?
Yes, the politics of identity is concerned with an acute sense of one's Islamic identity, or an acute sense of one's caste identity or Hindu identity, whatever may be the form of the identity that you were talking about or you were writing on. So this politics of identity concerns a certain cultural movement taking place all over India, which wished to establish the distinct Islamic identity of the Muslims, departing radically from a syncretic tradition which became a part of the life of the rural peasants. Think of Shattopir or the Pirism as a system. It was looked upon as an example of idolatry by the more devout Islamic preachers, fundamentalist Islamic preachers, who would like the Muslims to follow a truly Islamic way of life and not participate in the kind of idolatrous practices that these Muslim peasants in eastern Bengal practiced along with their Hindu neighbors. Hindus and Muslims together would offer incenses and sweets to the Pir or the Dargahs. They were worshippers of Pirism. The Shatto Pir is an example of this syncretic culture in rural Bengal. What is important is that you see in the latter half of the 19th century a very definitive challenge against this kind of a syncretic culture, which eventually merged into what we call the politics of identity. You have many examples from northern India, where the orthodox ulemas considered India to be polluted land because of the presence of a foreign ruler, and in that kind of a crisis of identity, when the Muslims were excluded from positions of authority, they insisted on a complete uncritical allegiance to an Islamic way of life. You have many institutions which actually propagated these ideas. You had many societies, even the journals and the periodicals that began to be published by these societies, the vernacular press at that, the Urdu press, they also insisted on the adherence to a truly Islamic way of life. In Bengal, you see the impact of these changes, eroding the basis of a syncretic culture to which many of the Muslim peasants actually subscribed. You have very important work by a Bangladeshi scholar, Rafiuddin Ahmed, who wrote a book called Muslims in Bengal, A Quest for Identity, in which Rafiuddin shows how the itinerant Maulavis were actually traveling all around eastern Bengal and holding debates in the countryside in which these men actually called upon the Muslims to adhere to a strict Islamic code of conduct, maintaining an Islamic way of life, eschewing the idolatrous practices, performing the Muslim religious rituals very faithfully, very scrupulously. And this was also the time when you see the emergence in Bengal of a certain kind of Bengali which came to be known as Islamic Bengali. The Bengali that was spoken by the ordinary people was normal, the kind of language that the ordinary people would speak. But then you will come across certain kinds of literature, nasihat namas, in which this kind of Islamic way of life was propagated, in which a distinct kind of Bengali began to be deployed by the authors of these texts, where you see the greater intrusion of use of Arabic and Persian words. So it is in this manner, as Rafiuddin suggests, that a distinct Islamic identity began to crystallize and consolidate its hold. But this doesn't mean separatist politics. This doesn't mean that this would necessarily create a certain demand for separate treatment. That is where the politics for privilege comes in. And when there is a certain kind of merger, convergence of politics of identity and politics for privilege, you see the emergence of the kind of demands that Syed Ahmed Khan had put up before the British, the claim for privileged treatment, a certain kind of communitarianism, but had this communitarianism had the potentiality to become the foundation for a more overtly communal and perhaps separatist tendencies among the Muslim elites. And this was what was precisely happening during the 1890s. As you know, the Hindu communalism that had become stronger during the decade of the 1890s had a very significant role to play in this case. You have already come to know about the Arya Samaj activities, the extremist political imagery, the idioms that the militant nationalists were using since the early 1890s. Nationalism came to be invaded by a good deal of Hindu imagery. Hindu history created a certain kind of consciousness by which Muslim rule was looked upon as tyrannical. The concept of Muslim tyranny became a reference point in this kind of historical consciousness. The Arya Samaj, which had in the early stage remained confined to educational activities, began to become a proselytizing organization. They had started the Suddhi movement with the intention of bringing those who had broken away from Hinduism back into the fold again, and the Suddhi movement was connected with Ved Prachar. You have the Sanatanists who had defended the orthodox Hinduism throughout the period when Arya Samaj was looking for reform in Hinduism. The Sanatanists and the Aryas actually resolved their differences and created a massive combination that started establishing the distinct Hindu identity as well. And you are familiar with some of those movements, the Gorakshini movements, the language controversy. And it is in this context that you see a very important change taking place on Syed Ahmed's politics. If you look at the 1880s, Syed Ahmed Khan was up in arms against the Congress. But the organization that he floated with the support of Theodore Beck, the principal of Aligarh College, was the United India Patriotic Association. This was in 1888, a few years after the foundation of the Congress. But the United India Patriotic Association had in its roles Urdu-speaking Hindu elites as well. It was not really a distinctly Muslim or communal organization. The Muslim aristocracy was willing to bring in the Hindu elites as well, who many of whom were actually Urdu speakers in their households. And 1888 was also the time, the year in which Badruddin Taibji, a Bohra Muslim from Western India, was made Congress president. So the Congress was actually making an attempt to cultivate support among the Muslim elites, educated elites, and Syed Ahmed Khan became frightened by the prospect of Congress actually eroding the basis of his power in northern India, and in an attempt to thwart the Congress attempts to cultivate relationships with the Muslim elites, he set up this United India Patriotic Association by cultivating support from the Urdu-speaking Hindu elites with the precise objective of protecting the interest of the aristocracy. It was not a communitarian body, so to say. Even though Syed Ahmed Khan was demanding special privileges or treatment from the government, it was not a overtly communal body. Totally different would be his approach in the 1890s. 1892 was a year of cow protection riots. And as you know, cow protectionism came as a kind of a cultural threat. Many of the eateries in North India owned by the Muslims had to be wound up under the directives of the municipalities, which came to be dominated by elected Hindu members. They were forbidden to sell beef. There was a major controversy about beef eating. Even though many of them Muslims were not beef eaters, they found this kind of policies as a threat to their cultural identity. And Urdu Nagari controversy had the same impact. The protagonist of Hindi movement succeeded in persuading the UP government towards the close of the 1890s to allow the use of Nagari. And the moment that was done, Syed Ahmed Khan actually by then was no more, but his followers set up the Urdu Defense Association. So Urdu Defense Association towards the close of the decade and the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental Defense Association, which Syed Ahmed set up in 1893, these were the two important steps that the elites of northern India had taken towards the creation of an overtly communal body in the form of the Muslim League. So one has to make a distinction between communitarianism, which was an attempt to defend the interest of the community, and communal politics, which was clearly linked up with the exclusion of other communities from the political sphere of the community. Something which would happen at the turn of the century, which would reach a point of climax in the foundation of Muslim League, and from then on, you see a certain history of gradual unfolding of the tragic drama that eventually led to the truncation of India. But that's a different story. Divide and rule succeeded because in the course of the 1890s, conditions emerged in which the politics of identity and the conflicts that this implied had created a condition in which the British could easily play with their divisive strategy. To those questions we shall turn later.